I'm really excited for this event and this panel that we've brought together. This is a culmination of several months of work and the product of so much collaboration across the tech sector and experts from corporate spaces and technologists to civil society leaders and academics, and a hint of public policy in there too. But we're really excited to have this live, and this is the initial start of this work. I want to acknowledge everybody who put in time and effort to this space, and also the other organizations that we are in community with who have been doing great work. I'm excited to have this conversation shortly because we'll be hearing from such leaders. As Cindy mentioned, you will also have an opportunity, recognizing that we, as Aspen, gather experts, and we don't want this to be a one-way conversation. We want this to be bi-directional, multi-directional, and for it to be actionable at the end of the day. A quick background, I should change my name, but it is Shreya Singh Hernandez. I use she, her pronouns. I am the data equity lead here at Aspen Digital and a senior program manager on the Empowered Communities team. As a quick introduction of our speakers, we have Dr. Madihah Akther, who is, in addition to being one of my favorite people to work with, is the co-lead of the Product Equity Working Group. She is a product equity practitioner in her own right. And Madihah, I'll let you introduce yourself again if you'd like when we get started. We will also be hearing from Miranda Bogen, who is the founding director of Center for Democracy and Technologies, or CDT's AI Governance Lab, where she works to develop and promote the adoption of robust and technically informed solutions for the effective regulation of governance of AI systems. Miranda is a leader in this space, and her team and she and her team put out a report a couple months ago titled Navigating Demographic Measurement for Fairness and Equity, that is among others that we recommend and have referenced in this resource as well. So with that, any additions to your introductions, Madihah or Miranda?
I'll just add that I worked with the responsible AI teams and product equity teams at Meta, so have a view kind of both from the industry and a civil society perspective.
Amazing. After that quick organizer pause, I'll launch right into the questions. We had so many around this resource, but I will get started with our first question around balancing fairness and privacy. How do we prioritize both fairness, equity, fairness, equity, and privacy in our processes, whether that's product development or AI systems? I'll open that up to anyone who wants to respond.
I can kick it off. So I think stepping back, when we think about product equity or fairness in the responsible AI context, one of the foundational assumptions or sort of desiderata of doing that is the ability to understand differences across groups. And as folks here probably have experienced, being able to run those measurements requires some way to differentiate among groups of people within a population or a user base. And often that data has been either restricted or has been, a company or organization has avoided collecting that data, or it can only be used for particular purposes because of the sensitivity when it comes to either privacy or potential misuse of that data. And increasingly, as there's been more attention to the need to advance equity within the tech space, privacy concerns that had sort of been a focus for a longer period of time have come into tension a little bit with the need to actually now be able to do these measurements. And I think that's what makes this work so challenging and so important. On the other hand, privacy itself can have equity implications. And so marginalized communities can be the victim of privacy harms at an increased rate from other groups. And so we need to be balancing the need to protect people and their identity and the risk that they might be targeted for any sort of concerning behavior or bad outcomes, while also being able to kind of conduct these comparative measurements across populations, across time, et cetera. So I think the main motivation for the report that I worked on was trying to make the point that to do equity and fairness measurements doesn't per se require suddenly collecting an enormous amount of sensitive data about individuals in a way that's durably associated with those individuals, which it can often seem like it would require that. But there are ways to collect it and, you know, contain that information in secure environments or dissociate that information from user IDs, whether permanently or temporarily, to use sort of surrogate characteristics. You know, people might call them proxies in certain contexts, but patterns that might indicate differences in communities without going so far as to presume people's identities, for instance. So usage of like accessibility features on a computer might be related to experiencing a disability. It isn't necessarily, and so it doesn't need to be used to infer that people have a disability, but it's still a relevant behavioral feature that you might want to test whether a product is working. And so I think differentiating some of those signals from identity is one potential way to think about privacy here. And then there's qualitative research and interesting sort of statistical approaches that can be used to avoid, again, collecting individualized sensitive information about people. And so I think there's just so much to explore here, and I'm really glad we're having this conversation, because people often, I think, get blocked either by colleagues or by concern over violations of privacy from engaging in this work. And I think that's where we have to push through and tackle this with nuance.
Yeah, I would just love to add and also echo what Miranda said. While the primer is very much about data collection, there's so much time spent in the before data collection, and even before we think about the how, we have to think about the why. So if the goal of product equity is really to create these joyful, representative experiences that enable everyone to grow and thrive, not every practice is always at the same stage of maturity. And so we might often have to start with thinking about evaluating and mitigating harm and risk also to the user as well. So even thinking about things like, what are the worst things that could happen to your team? If your team does not prioritize equity and fairness, what's going to happen with these users? You know, what is the threshold of unfairness that your product or your company can withstand if you're really not thinking about the needs of your users and making sure that you're mitigating harm and risk in working with them and co-creating with them? So data collection might not actually be the right approach for your team, your product, your company at this point in time for various reasons. So really thinking through that why, and thinking through maybe how you can understand your target audience or your current audience through other ways, such as data you can infer by proxy. And Miranda mentioned this as well. You have to be careful of proxy misuse as well. So always a couple of trade-offs and asterisks everywhere, but also maybe publicly available sources of data. So really trying to think creatively about how you might understand the communities that you are ensuring that you're trying to build with and for, and being really thoughtful about how to protect them as well.
Yeah, I'm excited for our next section after this to get a couple folks' response that is in the room with us today. Moving on to our next question about the granularity of data. Granularity is such an important aspect of this work. It's definitely been a through line of my career, talking about data disaggregation in the public policy sense. How do we make sure that you have the right level of data, especially when it comes to sensitive demographics, without overwhelming users or reinforcing stereotypes?
You want to kick that one off, Madihah?
I'll kick it off, but I'm definitely going to be looking at you to add some things in, Miranda. I hate saying this, but it really does depend. It depends on the context. It depends on the study. It depends on what questions you're looking to answer and how you're looking to answer them. I think what's really important when we think about the right level or the kind of how zoomed in are we on the data is making sure that you're having lots of conversations internally with your stakeholders around why are we collecting this data? Also, how can we minimize harm? And also you're thinking really carefully about the user groups that you're looking to work with, understanding them, understanding the challenges, the nuances of those groups in particular. But generally speaking, and the primer goes into this more as well, but thinking thoughtfully about aggregation and intersectional analyses is always really important. So there's a couple ways where you can think about tiered data collection, where you can offer kind of broad categories up front, maybe with an option for users to provide more granular detail if they choose, always making sure that they can opt out at any time for any reason. But also thinking intersectionally, so you don't just have a single axis of analysis, for example, race, but you're analyzing patterns across multiple dimensions. So you're thinking about race, gender, ability, kind of all of these, while ensuring that the privacy safeguards that you have set up are, they're in play at every single point of the process. And also there's a couple things to consider. For example, oversampling is something that you and your team might want to think about. And this is specifically for groups that are underrepresented. For example, Native Americans in the United States is, I think, an example of this, where you might want to consider oversampling so instead of proportional representation, so that you can generate more meaningful results for smaller groups, and also be really thoughtful about when you disaggregate that you're not having such a small group that it's really obvious where that information is coming from. So again, there's more in the primer and definitely more in Miranda's piece as well. But those are just a couple thoughts around disaggregation.
My mouth.
Miranda, you got something to
My
add.
mouth
Come on.
froze for a moment. Yeah, I think that the answer to this question is very much contextual, depending on sort of the scope of a population that you're looking at in the first place. If you're looking, within a particular US state, the categories that are relevant there might be very different than the national level, would be very different at the global level. And the size of that population is going to matter from a measurement perspective as well. So oversampling becomes super, super important, as Madihah mentioned. And as we're also trying to balance that privacy question, if you're thinking about k-anonymity and sort of only measuring if there's a minimum number of people in a group, that's going to be relevant. And if you're thinking about something like differential privacy or other privacy enhancing measurement approaches, those tend to affect the smaller groups within a population more than the larger groups. And so needing to kind of balance how granular are you trying to get in your understanding versus how sort of skewed or morphed are those results going to be as you introduce privacy protections. So thinking, it might be that different goals or sort of different initiatives require different levels of granularity or different types of aggregation of smaller groups, and making sure that even if more granular groups were initially presented, keeping in mind you don't want to overwhelm people with like a bajillion options, making sure that anyone who's tasked with aggregating them isn't making assumptions about which subgroups are kind of aggregated into higher order groups, because these are other places where misrepresentation and kind of presumption of identity can be introduced, not just in the selection of the groups themselves. There was a really good law review article that just came out a few days ago, and I'm now forgetting where it came from, but it actually introduced sort of a critique of comparative measurement by groups on the whole, because no one is any one group. And even if you're measuring several intersectional groups, there's so many individual circumstances that are going to relate to people's experiences. And so I think whatever the granularity that's selected, it's important both to remember and to include in any analysis, especially in communicating with other colleagues or teams, that these are sort of high-level observations or patterns that are indicative of issues that might need to be addressed, rather than quantitative targets that need to be predefined or to goal against and things like that. It can be really easy once there are numbers to set thresholds and create goals and things like that. But any selection of granularity here, given all these caveats, are going to have these missing elements that might not show up in that analysis. So that qualitative understanding of the circumstances that you're even looking at from a product equity or fairness perspective are really important, so you can contextualize those choices as well as the results that came about from those choices and the measurements related to them.
Yeah, this is such a tough question, and I think both of you have added so much context here and then in the reports as well. I'm really excited to look up that law review article as well, Miranda, that you mentioned. Our next question is about cross-functional collaboration. Many of the folks gathered here today were also present for the product equity in person hosted by Uber last fall for our product equity working group. And a lot of our conversation centered around how do we get legal, product, engineering, and AI teams on the same page when it comes to both data privacy and building equitable products and systems. What organizational structures or processes do you both recommend to make this happen effectively?
I think, as I'm sure folks have experienced in doing this type of work, one of the key challenges here is the translation across each of those teams. And so not presuming that just creating a cross-functional working group or a shared set of goals will lead to the most effective collaboration is the first step. While it can feel sometimes tedious to keep redefining these core concepts that might seem obvious to folks who've been working in particular parts of the space for a long time, making sure everyone understands what different words mean and also what different techniques mean, whether it's oversampling or certain types of privacy enhancing approaches. Subtle misunderstandings there can really throw wrenches in this whole process. Like the word bias has multiple meanings, statistical, legal, etc. And even that can lead to so much confusion about what is being measured and how risky that is from an organizational perspective, or what the implications are of a finding of a particular piece of research. So keeping your ear out for when there might be those mismatches in understanding is absolutely critical, even once you do have definitions, because kind of nipping those in the bud can really help smooth things over, whereas having them fester can lead to days and hours of pounding your head against the wall. And even thinking about different teams starting assumptions can be important. So in the past, in different contexts, I noticed that teams coming from different perspectives were using a similar methodology, but characterizing it in a very different way. And after several weeks and on-site meetings and things like that, we finally realized that what the difference was across the teams was that they were starting with a different null hypothesis. So one group was presuming statistically that there was no difference between groups, and the other was presuming that there was. And so they were using the same method, they were coming up with very different conclusions. And until we kind of sorted that out, it was very difficult to explain to people outside of that effort why there were some misalignments in how people were characterizing the work. And that can, again, just lead to the work being unnecessarily, slowed down or constrained or presumed to be riskier than it is, because people just don't understand what's happening. So thinking both about how teams are communicating with one another and how the work itself is being communicated to stakeholders, managers, kind of executives, external folks as well, is so important, so that those misunderstandings don't block what is really important work. And recognizing, I think, that there are going to be some competing needs. So, a lawyer who's focused on privacy is going to be thinking from a very different perspective than a team focused on equity or thinking about civil rights. But they don't, again, they can coexist. It's just trying to figure out what are the priorities people are bringing to the table and what might they not be expert in that they can learn more about, and try to find kind of a path through that tension.
Yeah, I definitely agree that fostering continuous education with your stakeholders is incredibly important. And it's not just the first thing to do, it's the thing that you're going to continue to do throughout all of your continued work with these folks. And really understanding your audience and making sure that they understand what the implications of this kind of work are for them, what the clear responsibilities, their role is, and how it is related to their jobs. This is something like product equity is something that needs to happen within all of the teams that you mentioned: legal, product engineering, AI teams, design, research, etc. Everybody has a stake in this work. So just really being able to help them understand what that stake is and what kind of role they can play is a really important part in starting to build some alignment. And again, everyone's practices are at different stages of maturity, but being able to establish a kind of governance and ownership with really clear accountability is going to be a very, very, very good first step in continuing to build some of that alignment with folks so they understand when to show up and how to show up and what kinds of questions they need to be asking and answering as well. And then also, of course, alignment on things like measurements, metric, what is success going to look like for us? How long are things going to take? Like a lot of the operational stuff is always, it's tough regardless of what work you're doing, and also continues to be tough when you have some of these other questions where maybe one person is a little bit more knowledgeable, other folks are not as knowledgeable, or it's new work potentially for your cross-functional partners.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you, both of you, for your insightful answers, and also for all of the work that you've done that has led up to this moment, and that you've published across your entire careers, frankly. I'm really excited for this conversation that will follow, but before I move on, I just wanted to give you both the gratitude for your leadership. I think we've set up really well for this next conversation. The Product Equity Working Group at the Aspen Institute cares a lot about procedure and how do we, implement think tank stuff. How do we implement these ideas into action at teams, at civil society organizations, in academia and public policy, et cetera. So this next portion will be incredibly important, especially as we've gathered, as I mentioned before, so many experts across the field, technologists and leaders in their own right in our audience today, to welcome you to join the roundtable. So with that, thank you so much, Miranda and Madihah, for your leadership and collaboration here.